We're going.
Morning, part two. We kind of ended last episode with more to say than the time allotted about the topics of beauty, subjectification, objectification, technology, etc. So what if we continue part two?
Yeah, you ended thinking you had more to say. I feel like I exhausted my wisdom on it. So go. Make me laugh. Make me think.
It's so different in the morning. Like ideas, are going at a certain speed, and then just the next day, like the world impinges, and you just care less about the thing. I have no idea what I wanted to talk about last time. Yeah, I mean, we were getting at like the social currency of beauty, like and the kind of beauty, not economy, but the beauty kind of almost like the ether of it. Like it exists. It's a thing we don't talk about often, but like it's you go on Instagram, you go on these apps, and what are the most popular things that people do? They beautify themselves in this artificial way. Everyone knows it's happening. Everyone knows they know they're doing it. They may be secretly doing it. They don't like admitting it. And maybe they presume that other people aren't. And it's this very, very odd, just kind of effectively like cultural body dysmorphia, right?
Yeah.
Where the kind of understanding of what should be is just so different than what people projected. So I don't know.
So it goes back to also our traditional notions of idealized beauty. We were talking about Platonic ideals yesterday, and like Roger Scruton's, like the conservative, philosopher of aesthetics, who thinks that art should point us to this Platonic beauty. And in some sense, obviously, that's happening even on Instagram, right? I mean, art has always been artifice. It's not supposed to be just a representation of the mundane, of the worldly, right? So there's some deep intuition and kind of instinct to idealize when we represent. And is that inherently wrong? I mean, we talk about it in social media in one way, and we talk about it in, Botticelli in another, or what am I thinking of? The Mystic Nativity or something. Like idealized beauty in a Renaissance painting, no one says like, oh, well, that's not actually what they look like, and yet when people do it as filters on Instagram, I mean, obviously there's a facility to it that maybe takes away the art, right? But what else is wrong with like creating this false representation?
Well, you've effectively given people sculpting tools, right? And now they see themselves as the work of art, and they see themselves as flawed in some way, and they see themselves as in need of beautification or cheekbones or kind of a whitening or darkening. And it's like, I mean, I haven't heard anyone since like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Pumping Iron talk about the as well about the body as like the body as sculpture and the body as canvas. And he was like, no, I am doing for my body what like, the best sculptors did for their pieces of art. And I just wonder about the, not in like a kids these days way, but just, I find it very interesting that you have these tools now. Like it used to be the case that you would get kind of beautified by a magazine if you did end up in the magazine, or you would have beauty products that would try to shape your sculpture based on like the visage on the cover of them. But now every day, hundreds of times a day, people are resculpting themselves.
Yeah.
And they've internalized their own body as the thing that is the canvas.
And eventually it's going to butt up against real life. So if you're on a dating app and you see somebody who's their photos, like I'm on Tinder, so like I'll scan through, and sometimes you see somebody that's so obviously full of filters that you can tell that this is not anything like what they look like in real life. Now, a certain amount, obviously people want to put flattering photos of themselves up, right? And so we have like this kind of, I think a few degrees of tolerance for the fact that when you meet the person in real life, they're gonna. But I can't help wonder that when we're gonna hit the day, and I imagine it's gonna be in our lifetimes, where your glasses are doing the beautifying in augmented reality, and you're never gonna encounter what the person actually looks like, right? Like the way we butt up against reality versus this idealized reality is mediated by technology in a really interesting way that seems like it's in a transitional place right now, where eventually the whole world will be kind of manipulated in this way in real time.
I was asked once to be either a consultant or a participant, I forget which, on an idea for a kind of avatar dating, where almost like a Cyrano de Bergerac style thing, where for whatever reason you don't want to go on the first date yourself, until you basically have two actors play the people on the date, and then the two people who are actually on the date are kind of feeding the lines that they say into their ear live dynamically in real time. And so I had, of course, thought my just very simple, like this was presented to me on the phone, and my very simple first thought was like, oh, okay, people that are maybe uncomfortable might actually enjoy this kind of avatarized dating where they don't have to be there in person and uncomfortable with their own body or canvas. And I asked them like the kinds of people that they imagined signing up for this. And what they had said was actually both, all kinds, that effectively like people that are worried about their looks, in terms of like maybe they don't always get the opportunity to talk to the people they want to because they're less attractive than they'd like. Those people might sign up, but also people that are too attractive and are worried that their looks are masking the actual conversation or the actual intimacy or getting to know someone they might develop. And so I found it just kind of odd that all kinds might enjoy hiding, or like there's a lot of reasons that you might want to actually hide your physical appearance when getting to know someone. Yeah. And so there's a sense in which this is almost like a matter of degree and not kind, where as you get these Instagram filters that add more and more superficial layers and kind of distort reality more and more and cause more and more of this dysmorphia, I assume that'll be pathological amongst an entire generation at some point. You might just be feeding that same tendency to actually want to connect with people on a deeper level at first. Like you're effectively avatarizing yourself. You're doing what this show or whatever it was wanted to do. You're kind of always going on dates as avatars.
So according to Heidegger, there's a history of the understanding of being in the West, right? What it is to be a thing and what it is to be a human changes according to the era that we're in, right? And part of what like instigates those changes and kind of manifests them is art, right? And so, and an artwork doesn't have to be a painting. It can be a temple where the gods live. It can even be a person, like Jesus Christ was kind of counts as an artwork because he held up for, what matters for that time, right? And I think according to him, what's wrong with not what's wrong, but what we need to think about is that we are in the technological era of understanding of being. And that doesn't mean that it's because it's dominated by technological devices. But what he thought of as technology was everything is a resource to be manipulated, and including eventually ourselves, which is what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that should be maximally kind of malleable, right, into whatever it is that you need. So an object that was a great object in the past, let's say like, a piece of wood, let's say, for a sculptor to make into something. The wood had some kind of force of its own. So the sculptor is kind of like responding to the grain of the wood, or, a musician in days past would like learn their instrument, and it would be very specific to that place and that time. And we've talked about this a bit before. But if you contrast that with the cell phone disappears almost as an object. It's like omnipresent and also invisible in the sense that it can be an instrument. I play some musical instruments on here, but it's also your alarm clock, and it's also your camera, and it's also your beautifier, right?
Yeah.
And
When I look at when I look at my phone, I see the people that I might closely interact with. Like I look at the phone and see the social implications of the phone. I don't even see the device. I see like, am I being communicated with?
Yeah.
Right. It disappears into the background like a doorknob, like a well-functioning doorknob.
And the problem with the technological device versus the thing that pushes back is that it obviates the need for any sort of skill. So, we've talked about this before as well, but like the I think in terms of this, it's interesting, like the difference between the painter that masterfully, sat with you for days and painted you and brought out your best qualities. There was a kind of meaningful interaction going on there. And then for the person who looked at the painting, probably compared it, like if someone had a portrait in their house, there was more of a relationship with reality. And that reality was something that had some sort of like strength to push back. Whereas the reality today has less and less, ability to push back. And therefore everything is showing up as more meaningless.
And you trusted the eye and the point of view of the painter to do something different, as a photographer might. Whereas now it's an algorithmic improvement, right? That it's the opposite of personalized. It's completely general. And so where you might have a portrait or just the art of portraiture before was this communication between artist and subject and environment, right? Where Madame X is a pose, right? Madame X is a woman posing in a very particular way that Sargent found compelling, that had a conflict between her marriage and her kind of sexuality. And now you take the people pose, but the way in which the details and the curves and the light matter can just be completely, it's like in post. We're all in post-production now, right? We don't have to do any of the like principal photography anymore. It like most of it happens in post. So and that I insofar, okay, there's only one particular thing I worry about, which is that there's this old study. I mentioned this in a very, very early episode, but there's an old study where as artistic output, poets, the word frequency of poets was analyzed, and they found that those poets who were more likely to commit suicide versus those that didn't had self-referential words. So they used the word I, just I, meaning me, in their published poetry more often than those that did not commit suicide. And so when I think about this, the potential effects of this kind of like self as sculpture, continually giving yourselves the sculpting tools, the kind of inherent meanness that these things kind of almost cultivate or encourage, I do wonder the degree to which, we're more concerned with the I.
Yeah.
And in the mental health world, we know that is pathological and not a good thing.
And there's two like Buddhist sayings that I always come back to, that if you take there's one and then there's a corollary. If you take this, and this is apt also in the or useful in polyamory, which is if you take the selfishness out of jealousy, you get admiration. So if you stop worrying about how this fact that this person is great is as compared to you might just admire the person. And the corollary is if you take the selfishness out of anger, you get determination. Often determination to change what it is that's making you angry, sure. Right? So the way artists often, I think, are in touch with the kind of, how can I put this? Like the things that are bubbling up in the culture that are like signaling that there's a difference in the understanding of being. And they somehow are receptive to things that are unspoken in the culture and haven't yet happened. And like Nietzsche proclaiming the death of God in like 1880 or something, he was foreshadowing and being, and I think the work he did in is The Gay Science, which is a great book I highly recommend. So in 1907 or 1909, E.M. Forster, great writer, wrote a book called The Machine Stops. And in the first 5 pages of this, or 3 pages, which I'd like to read, he really astonishingly predicts the mood, not only just the mood of our age, 110 years later, but the specifics of it. So I think if you listen to this, he predicts iPads, Amazon, Uber, intercontinental jet travel, and online courses, YouTube, FaceTime, Spotify, and as astonishing as all that, the mood of kind of passivity that all of these technologies have like put us into. And it's just crazy. It's like this guy traveled in a time machine and came here. The only difference is that like they still imagine things working with knobs instead of like touch screen. But you'll see like she holds up a plate that is like an iPad and talks to her son who's halfway around the world. And remember that this is before there was commercial flights, before there was television. I mean, there was like very primitive movies without sound. So the idea of this being so well predicted, I think, illustrates that if somebody is sensitive enough as an artist, they feel the things that are giving rise to this, which is not just technological innovation. It's also just a shift in what matters. And I think that I just want to read like the first 4 pages of this. This is in the public domain. So I found this on Amazon, like as just a kind of a pamphlet. It's called The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster.
It's also a return to what matters, right? Because regardless of all this fanciful technology, it's just two people trying to talk to each other. No matter what technology comes online, the first thing people do is just try to talk to each other with it. It's remarkable.
It is, but it's also like, how do we engage with each other in a way that matters? Like the fact that, podcasts, you can tell when they're doing them remotely and they're not as good. Like the fact that we're sitting in the same room talking to each other, that matters, right?
Yeah.
And technology wants to make that not matter. Technology wants to make it so that the skill that used to be required to do something is no longer required. Like the promise of technology is like, you don't have to be a master chef to buy this microwave meal and put it in the oven. And the only problem is that maybe it's not quite, hasn't reached the deliciousness of the master chef meal, but that's only a problem with just like, that it just hasn't advanced enough. There's always the promise that if it went a little farther, then we'd be okay. But there's not a recognition that we're losing something in the process, and that engagement with like real objects that push back and real people that are actually there, and the flaws that we have that are actually part of what makes us unique, instead of making everybody look the same,
And these Instagram kind of filters and beautification processes are really just like the easy bake oven of the artist's eye, right?
Exactly.
Like you don't have to know the culinary chemistry anymore. You don't have to actually know how to sculpt. You just
push a button. And the problem with that is that anybody can push that button, so you're no different from anybody else. Right. And then the filter is applied universally to everyone, right? So we have to just recognize that the technology is a double-edged sword, that we are losing something, and maybe if we are aware of that loss, we can respond to it.
The easy bake oven is very popular.
Yes. So imagine, if you can, a small room, hexagonal in shape, like the cell of a bee. Have I read you this?
I know it, yeah. You haven't read it to me, but my inner voice has read it to me.
It is lighted neither by window nor by lamp, yet it is filled with a soft radiance. I mean, again, this is the early days of electricity even. And even the idea of light coming specifically from a fire versus like a radiance of an entire room, or even the warmth. Imagine like the warmth where people used to go and gather around a fire and therefore like have a focal, the word focal comes from fire, focal, right? A focal activity. And you compare that to like Bert Dreyfuss used to talk about, like his daughter used to like go sit by where the heat came out of the floor because she liked the warmth of that place, and she would do her homework there. And that was like this impoverished version of the fire. And then even that went away when you had like radiant heat in the floor. And suddenly there was no place anymore that was more special than any other place. It didn't matter where you sat, right, to do the homework.
Yeah.
And therefore the world shows up as impoverished. So this is a very important little detail. It is lighted neither by window nor by lamp, yet it is filled with a soft radiance. There are no apertures for ventilation, yet the air is fresh. I don't think there was air conditioning in 1907. There are no musical instruments, and yet at the moment that my meditation opens, this room is throbbing with melodious sounds. An armchair is in the center. By its side, a reading desk. That is all the furniture. And in the armchair, there sits a swaddled lump of flesh. A woman about 5 feet high, with a face as white as a fungus. It is to her that the little room belongs. An electric bell rang. The woman touched a switch, and the music was silent. Gives me chills how accurate this is of our age. I suppose I must see who it is, she thought, and set her chair in motion. The chair, like the music, was worked by machinery, and it rolled her to the other side of the room, where the bell still rang importunately. Who is it? She called. Her voice was irritable, for she had been interrupted often since the music began. She knew several thousand people. Facebook, anyone? In certain directions, human intercourse had advanced enormously. But when she listened into the receiver, her white face wrinkled into smiles, and she said, "Very well, let us talk. I will isolate myself. I do not expect anything important will happen for the next 5 minutes, for I can give you fully 5 minutes, Kuno. Then I must deliver my lecture on, quote, music during the Australian period." Online schools and lectures and YouTube. She touched the isolation knob so that no one else could speak to her. Then she touched the lighting apparatus, and the little room was plunged into darkness. "Be quick," she called, her irritation returning. "Be quick, Kuno. Here I am in the dark, wasting my time." But it was fully 15 seconds before the round plate that she held in her hands began to glow. A faint blue light shot across it, darkening to purple, and presently she could see the image of her son, who lived on the other side of the earth, and he could see her. "Kuno, how slow you are," he smiled gravely. "I really believe you enjoy dawdling. I have called you before, mother, but you were always busy or isolated. I have something particular to say." "What is it, dearest boy? Be quick. Why could you not send it by pneumatic post?" Email. "Because I prefer saying such a thing. I want you to come to see me." Vashti watched his face in the blue plate. "But I can see you," she exclaimed. "What more do you want?" "I want to see you not through the machine," said Kuno. I think the machine is the internet. Said Kuno. "I want to speak to you not through this wearisome machine." "Oh, hush," said his mother, vaguely shocked. "You mustn't say anything against the machine." "Why not?" "One mustn't." "You talk as if God had made the machine," cried the other. "I believe that you pray to it when you are unhappy. Men made it. Do not forget that. Great men, but men. The machine is much, but it is not everything. I see something like you in this plate, but I do not see you. I hear something like you through this telephone, but I do not hear you. That is why I want you to come. Pay me a visit so that we can meet face to face and talk about the hopes that are in my mind." She replied that she could scarcely spare the time for a visit. "The airship barely takes 2 days to fly between me and you." "I dislike airships." "Why?" "I dislike seeing the horrible brown earth and the sea and the stars when it is dark. I get no ideas in an airship." "I do not get them anywhere else." "What kind of ideas can the air give you?" He paused for an instant. "Do you not know 4 big stars that form an oblong, and 3 stars together in the middle of the oblong, and hanging from the stars 3 other stars?" "No, I do not. I dislike the stars. But did they give you an idea? How interesting. Tell me." "I have an idea that they were like a man." "I do not understand." "The 4 big stars are the man's shoulders and his knees. The 3 stars in the middle are like the belts that men wore once, and the 3 stars hanging are like a sword." "A sword?" "Men carried swords with them to kill animals and other men." "It does not strike me as a very good idea, but it is certainly original. When did you come to you first?" "In the airship." He broke off, and she fancied that he looked like. She could not be sure, for the machine did not transmit nuances of expression. It only gave a general idea of people, an idea that was good enough for practical purposes, Vashti thought. The imponderable bloom, declared by a discredited philosophy to be actual essence of intercourse, was rightly ignored by the machine, just as the imponderable bloom of the grape was ignored by the manufacturers of artificial fruit. Something good enough had long been accepted by our race. The truth is, he continued, that I want to see the stars again. They are curious stars. I want to see them not from the airship, but from the surface of the earth, as our ancestors did thousands of years ago. I want to visit the surface of the earth. She was shocked again. Mother, you must come, if only to explain to me what is the harm of visiting the surface of the earth. No harm, she replied, controlling herself, but no advantage. The surface of the earth is only dust and mud. No advantage. The surface of the earth is only dust and mud. No life remains on it. You would need a respirator, or the cold of the outer air would kill you. One dies immediately in the outer air. I know, of course. I shall take all precautions. And besides, well, she considered and chose her words with care. Her son had a queer temper, and she wished to dissuade him from the expedition. It is contrary to the spirit of the age, she asserted. Do you mean by that contrary to the machine? In a sense, but his image in the blue plate faded. Kuno? He had isolated himself. For a moment, Vashti felt lonely. Then she generated the light, and the sight of her room, flooded with radiance and studded with electric buttons, revived her. There were buttons and switches everywhere, buttons to call for food and music, for clothing, Amazon, and what's it called? What's the one that you can order food with? Anyway, there's an app for that, of course. There was a hot bath button, by pressure of which a basin of imitation marble rose out of the floor, filled to the brim with warm, deodorized liquid. There was the cold bath button. There was the button that produced literature. There were, of course, the buttons by which she communicated with her friends. The room, though it contained nothing, was in touch with all that she cared for in the world. Vashti's next move was to turn off the isolation switch, and all the accumulations of the last 3 minutes burst upon her. The room was filled with the noise of bells and speaking tubes. What was the new food like? Could she recommend it? Has she had any ideas lately? Might one tell her one's own ideas? Would she make an engagement to visit the public nurseries at an early date, this day, this month? To most of these questions, she replied with irritation, a growing quality of that accelerated age. She said that the new food was horrible, that she could not visit the public nurseries, through press of engagements, that she had no ideas of her own, but had just been told one. 4 stars and 3 in the middle were like a man. She doubted there was much of it. Then she switched off her correspondence, for it was time to deliver her lecture on Australian music. Anyway, it goes on like this. I won't continue, but I highly recommend. You can even find it on YouTube, the entire thing read out loud. It takes an hour, and it's one of the most moving, prescient, and I think timely stories I've ever read in my life. The machine stops.
So what does it mean to be good enough to be practical, or to present something good enough to be practical, right? I mean, that was one of the basics, the arguments there, that the video phone or the video plate or whatever, transmits only enough that is useful, that these virtual experiences of the earth or of music convey just enough, good enough. A digital recording that you play through your speaker is not the same thing as listening to a symphony, in the same way that the remote podcast conversation is not the same thing as the in-person one. There is something different. But the speaker transmits good enough. FaceTime transmits good enough. You just need some lips moving around, and you want to get a general sense of the person's kind of affect and tone and maybe their smile. But you don't see their entire body. I spent months getting to know someone, pandemically, and or just virtually over these Zoom things. And You don't know what like the back of their head looks like. You know, you don't know what kinds of shoes they wear.
Yeah.
But what is transmitted to you is good enough. And Tinder, this app that you're on, like you are trying to compress what it is to be a person, what it is to be a romantic object and a romantic object of interest into something good enough, right? You take the photos that are good enough and you give your verbal description of you and your like on paper life story to be good enough. And so like, why though is that not what we do all the time, always, even in person? Like I actually see no fundamental difference between the kind of virtual remote versions of displaying good enough versus you meet someone in person for the first time. Everyone has like one night's worth of good stories and anecdotes, and you just try to be good enough on that first date or on that first encounter. But you're still presenting a shallow, kind of compressed version of yourself, no matter what you're doing in social interaction, whether or not it's in real life or virtually.
But so we're always, all of reality in some sense is representation.
Yeah, and so I guess it's like there appears to be some sort of like magical prescience to Ian Forster here, where it's like, okay, 100 years later, look at all the things that we have. But it's also, there aren't that many just like basic categories of commodity in the world. There's like energy, there's food, there's communication, there's entertainment, and there's transportation. That's like it. Like every single thing that we do as humans, you could bring into one of those 5 buckets. And so what I do love about those few pages is no matter the technology, people want to communicate, they need to eat, energy comes and goes, they need to transport themselves, and they want to entertain. And it's like those things are, regardless of the technology, manifest, and it's just people want to talk to each other, they want to see each other, they want to experience things as they actually are.
But the fact that, that he was like predicting that these, because of technology and the desire to have everything omnipresent and available, that there would be a loss in that.
Yeah, exactly.
That we would be losing something as much as gaining something. Because he could be writing a celebratory version of that. Everything will be available to all people at all times, and you'll be able to talk across the world and everything. But there's this sadness to the mood, which is what is the most amazing thing that he captured.
I think it was Maxim Gorky. Is that a filmmaker? Does that ring a bell?
I think he was a painter. There was Gorky, a son and a father. There's a father and son, Gorky, I think.
It's a comment on the first black and white films. I think he was one of the first, or rather one of the first times he saw black and white film in the late 19th century. His response was like, "This is deficient. This is not real life. You know, you've washed away the color palette of real life. How could this ever be art?"
Yeah.
And you wonder like the degree to which you're washing away certain aspects of personality when you're displaying yourself on these things. And I also like, so I kind of want to talk about, okay, so
just so you know, Maxim Gorky was a 1868 to 1936 Russian and Soviet writer, the founder of socialist realism. And I think his son was a famous painter as well.
Okay.
Another Gorky.
It's his comment on film that I remember.
He also made films, it looks like.
Oh, yeah, he did make them, I think. But so he found them deficient relative to real life. And that is an interesting question, right? We debate this all the time. Whether or not the narrowed point of view can enhance aspects of life or whether or not it's fundamentally compressed and deficient. So I think the technological kind of intersection with romance and sex and Instagram and Tinder and all these things has led to like more imitation than I remember as a kid growing up. Maybe I just wasn't able to observe it because I was developing myself. But like, okay, so I was researching book on elegance, and I ended up going to the Congo to try to find this gentleman's society of ambiance. They call themselves the ambiance makers for the preservation of elegance in the middle of Goma in the part of the DRC. And they dress up in fashion that is Italian and Belgian and kind of European in style. In the middle, you know, instead of buying a plot of land, they'll buy a pair of nice Italian loafers. And so I went there kind of with this idea that, maybe elegance, by virtue of their preservation of it, is some sort of imitative thing. And I found it interesting that maybe the way that you learn a skill as a ballerina or as a very good basketball player, or like Lionel Messi as he carves his way through like a sports field, that maybe the way that you arrive at deep and true elegance and perfected elegance is you get there by imitation. Is you get there by imitating your way up until at some point you achieve an aesthetic transcendence, and then suddenly you are elegant by virtue of having watched enough people be elegant. And when I was there, so that was the kind of theory I went with, that a lot of what the human brain does is it imitates. And I went and I noticed, I ended up like going out into the living room of these gorillas. You like walk into the forest, and there's a tiny toddler gorilla, and the tiny toddler gorilla beat its chest. It was a small little male gorilla, right? And it beat its chest so hard that it fell over from the force. It was fucking adorable, right? It was a tiny little baby just beating itself backwards. And of course it was doing so because it without understanding the social, sexual dominance implications of the gesture, which is what the silverbacks use it for, right? Is imitation and display and hierarchy. This little tiny toddler version had no idea what it was doing. It wasn't a silverback yet, but it was doing this display. And then kind of driving around in the town at the like base of the volcano, I noticed people, I mean, it just is what it is, but like the people would wave at a kind of a white person in a car driving by. It's just true. And I noticed that there were toddlers, like tiny babies, that were also waving without understanding at all the social implications, whatever the hell waving means in this context at this time, the awkwardness of the thing, the who I am, who they are, etc. It's this kind of like pre-understanding. In times of pre-understanding, the human brain, the way that it learns is it imitates. Mm-hmm. It imitates like mad. And what was I doing there? I was imitating like these 80s, 90s adventure romance novels and movies I had read, and like what I thought my father would have wanted me to do in an imitative way. And my graduate school advisor had also run off to Africa, had also studied things in Kenya. So I was like, I'll do it in a way that's similar but different enough to count as my own thing. So I was imitating all over. There were layers and layers and layers of imitation. The Gentleman's Society, me, the toddler gorilla, the like, who knows why we're doing what we're doing? We're just imitating all over the place. And I feel like one thing that like these kind of apps and things and this beautification convergence towards what it means to what cheekbones are supposed to look like, what, jawlines are supposed to look like. What these filters do is they're causing a kind of implicit imitation, right? Where people have started imitating themselves. And you and I have talked about this a bunch, where I feel like I've observed people show up here at this Airbnb property and do a thing in an image in a photo that they've seen previously. Like they perform as if it's imitative. They've seen a photo on your Instagram, or they've seen a photo on your Airbnb, and they liked the photo. And so then they appear and they show up, and in the same way people pose in front of those, like the middle of those colored wings everywhere, effectively, I guess, just to look like other people that have previously done that. They do that here to some degree. And so when we're talking about the implications of technology for the way that we might interact in a beauty level and with beauty in between us, right? Can we like, what is, so what I find interesting is when, all right. So we ended last episode talking about you and what happens when, someone, your kind of ex-wife ended up getting this hierarchical emblem medal of being ranked, the sexiest woman alive, right? And what I find, like, do you think on some level, and I think this is a convergence of both technology and these kind of like higher philosophical ideas of beauty, do you think on some level that when a woman now desires you and knows that fact and or makes out with you, that they think some aspect of that rubs off, kind of like makeup, onto them? Do you think there's imitative transitivity?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, you put me on the spot. I don't know. I haven't thought about this. And I don't know how comfortable I am diving into what you'd have to unpack to answer that. But I do think there's a beauty to imitation that we're always trying to achieve. Like, I'm thinking about it just like in terms of learning an instrument, like, and all the teachers I've had, and I've like sat down with people who play much better than me and tried to imitate them, right? And then there's a point where I think the upper level of imitation that's available by technology is by definition an impoverished imitation, right? So like the filter that makes you look like the celebrity or makes you look like this, it's leveling down in a way. It's like not answering to the specificity of who you are, right? Whereas if when you learn the instrument with enough practice, your imitation becomes your own and somehow achieves, if you're lucky, an equality, and if you're even luckier and harder working, a superiority to the imitation that it sprung from, right?
Right.
So the goal is to play better than the teacher, right? Eventually, because they are limited by where they came from, and they've, each generation as an art form especially is moving up before it becomes decadent, before it becomes mannerist, before it becomes purely imitative. I mean, this happened if you look at the Renaissance, right? Like there was a greater and greater accomplishment of technique, let's say in perspective or in painting beautiful portraits of people. And then it reached its apex with Michelangelo. And the same thing happened in the flamenco world with Paco de Lucia as a guitarist, where that an artist comes along and there really can be no further. Like they just the originality, the passion, and the technique converge into perfection. And then you get mannerism, which is like hundreds of years after the Renaissance of just you get academic painting, right? You get people who are get really good at imitating that technique, but there's no more originality possible until a new style is born, right? When then all of a sudden, the hundreds of years later, Picasso shows up, and the scale of measure is no longer the same. You can't say, like, is Picasso a better painter than Michelangelo? They're doing different things. They're so different stylistically that you can't even hardly call it the same thing anymore, right?
But so do you think it's the amount of exposure, though, that shapes or enhances the ability to imitate? So one of the things that you mentioned, I think rightly, is like in the Machine Stops, it was a striking feature of that woman's life that she knew thousands of people.
Yeah.
That was like glibly or like cutely mentioned as like, oh my God, who could possibly keep track of thousands of people? But now we have technology to aid in our ability to keep track of thousands of people.
Yeah.
Tens of thousands of people. Hundreds. For some people have fucking millions of followers, right?
Yeah.
And that like gives you effectively like a larger well from which to draw your imitative either undercurrent or like, people are imitating in a way that they've never been able to before because they have access to the faces, the bodies, the mannerisms, the style, the lifestyle of millions of people. Yeah. You can follow anybody and you can imitate anybody. And like, what is happening to the imitative brain if all we do is we're effectively just sponges for imitation? It's what mammals do. It's how mammals learn. It's how we transfer knowledge through the generations. It's all we do. It's how we learned how to walk and talk and move and everything.
And somehow there's such a thing as being so true to what you're imitating and also truly original and authentic. And I can't think of any place better to see this than like the blues. Look up on YouTube, Lightning Hopkins. One of the coolest, most original, most stylish, most amazingly musical, blues players that's ever been. And somehow you listen to him just play a few notes, and it's just so deeply, authentically the blues. It could be nothing else. There's no more authentic manifestation or iteration of this style. And yet it's also equally 100% him and couldn't be anyone else. That's a really profound paradox that it's like, I don't know what the answer is, but you'll never get that with an Instagram filter. Like, how do you cultivate originality through imitation, through being true to that which you're trying to emulate, which in these cases are a world of a certain like technique or a certain art form, right? Or including just of personality. Like, I do think that if you, in this age when we're all looking at our phones and living through this, you meet fewer people that are truly original and fun to be around, right? Because of that originality, because they surprise you with what they say.
Because everything rubs off transitively like makeup.
Yeah.
I do think you end up inheriting the stories and the mannerisms and sometimes the cadence of, we're exposed to even on an intellectual level. And I think there's a kind of makeup industry for ideas out there. And it's a lot of podcasts and it's a lot of like industry of, oh, here's who thinks this person thinks this about that. Therefore, when you then go to the dinner party, you then say without attribution, like, here's my opinion on that critical theory that I actually have never read the primary source of, but I heard it mentioned on a podcast. To me, that's no different than applying rouge to your cheek and trying to look like a tuberculin noble, or and it's an industry, and it's a beautification industry, but it's a beautification of the mind industry, and I think it's equally as kind of insidious and superficial.
So I think as you imitate and you become more skillful, one of the things you want to achieve is a greater and greater ability to make more and more minute distinctions, right? It's not a coincidence that the musician that's most impressive might be the fastest too, right? Obviously, you don't want to take that too literally and don't want to just achieve like technique for its own sake. But there is something to be said for someone who's able to make these more and more minute gestures with precision, right? And that's a beautiful thing to behold, right? And there's something about engaging skillfully in that imitative practice which allows for that, which is not allowed for in the technological iteration of it. And I think someone like Schwarzenegger, who like achieved his muscles by going to the gym every day, is going to have a different relationship to the world, to his muscles, to himself, and to the people who encounter him and behold him with awe than the person who has a filter to make themselves look muscly, right? We want to go into a world that's more and more rich with meaningful differences and our own ability to make meaningful distinctions. And that's what I think we got to be careful of while we're doing this imitation, right?
Yeah. And how those distinctions like create the hierarchy in some sense. You need gradations in order to know the difference, in order to be able to either verbalize or see the difference.
And then we want to be made out with, and we want to be made love to because of who we actually are, right? This goes back now to the anti-Platonism that we started kind of hinted at yesterday. What's wrong with Scruton's like desire to find beauty only in the eternal, in the timeless? Because what's great, in a way, that's the Instagram filter is this neo postmodern Platonism happening. It's this like equalizing of a standard of beauty, and it's like making everything the same, and it's denying the specificity. And why is it even more exciting to, encounter a maybe a fundamentally nihilistic work of art if it's responding to the specificity of what matters in our age? So I think that's where you get to be a positive nihilist. You get to be an optimist about nothing. And that's, in a way, I think, more exciting and exhilarating and more engaging and more meaningful than the false kind of leveled and otherworldly sense of what matters and what's beautiful, if that makes sense.
So one of the ways that you can get away from the ethereal idea of like a divine or platonic beauty is like I kind of think of sometimes there's a germ theory of beauty, that like it proximity matters and that it can rub off. People do weird things. They'll purchase off of eBay like celebrity tokens, a half-eaten sandwich by a famous or attractive person, things like that. There's a kind of sense in which, they'll do this all for the antagonists of the world, but there's a sense in which like there's a germ, like there's almost a celebrity germ theory. There's almost a beauty germ theory where like proximity to it makes people feel better.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And what like, but
And worse at the same time.
yeah, it can do both and worse, but you're kind of like gravitationally pulled in some way that you don't understand. And so that's kind of what I was getting at the emotion of transitivity, where like, I mean, the inherent logic of germ theory is that it can pass between people, right? Is that proximity matters, and that proximity is relevant on an epidemiological level to the passage of germs. And I think a lot of these kind of like imitative acts are about this kind of germ theory, where you presume that by proximity to, by acknowledgement, through acknowledgement from like someone you follow, just by virtue of being what appears to be close to them.
Yeah.
So celebrity tabloid rags will do this thing where they'll always use the first name of celebrities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've noticed this a bunch because I have a strange look about me where I often have people think, you've encountered this many times, people often think they've met me before.
Right.
And they don't know why. And they don't know how to place it. But they'll do this interesting linguistic thing where they'll always say, you look like my friend, or
Yeah.
you look like Celebrity X, you look like Drake, you look like LMFAO, you look like
Right.
Norman, all these things. And it's never they look like you, right?
Right.
It's always you look like. And there's an implicit hierarchy. And it
You know, in Italian good old fashioned manners, you're never supposed to say you look like. You're supposed to say they look like.
good.
That's-
That's
yeah.
the way it should be. I'm liking Italy more and more. And what I find interesting is like, I think the reason that linguistic tick is one way and not the other is because it makes sense that the person you know most should be the one that is the comparison, the center of the comparison. And me, who they've just met, they don't know me. So therefore, just based on like experience with that person over time, experience with the comparison over time, you know, I'm new, so I look like the thing they're more familiar with.
Right.
And celebrity magazines do this where they will use first names, right? For most of the celebrities, they'll always use first names as if when do you use first names? You use first names with friends. So what are they trying to do? They're trying to create virtual intimacy. They're trying to create the feeling that as you're flipping through this, as you're paying your juice to look at pictures of faces of higher status males and reddened asses, you feel like there's an actual social relationship between you and the person on the page. You feel like there's a kind of friendship. We're on a first name basis. This is why people, when they encounter celebrities, often mistake that the person knows them or cares at all
Yeah.
about them, right? And like, I think the network connections and graphs on social media, the networks and connections of graphs on Instagram, where you can have 10,000 people, they're effectively tabloid rags, the logic and emotion of tabloid rags, but for just non-celebrities. And so what you end up feeling is a kind of intimacy and friendship that doesn't exist and is not real, but fundamentally is poking at the germ theory of beauty, that people follow beautiful people want to be close to it. And when they go on Instagram and it's right on their phone, you know how I said when I look at my phone, I don't see the phone itself. I just see the people that could be communicating with me. I see my social circle. I see the people that I love and care about. And I just want, when you do that and you can open that up and have strangers, some of whom you've never met, but are beautiful by some dimension that you know, at this time and age find worthwhile to pursue, like, it feels as if they're your friend. It feels as if they're close. It feels as if they can rub off on you, like makeup, like these things. And so that was the heart of my question about, do people inherit transitivity of beauty? Like,
For sure. And I've noticed it. I've become friends with people because, not become friends, but I've been attracted to people because they are friends of people that I admire. And I think what's happening in my head is, wow, those people that I admire, let's say a famous person, who's famous for a good reason, you know, like a great film director or something, right? You assume in the background that they have the choice to hang out with anybody.
yeah.
So if they're hanging out with that person must be great also, right? And so then you're curious about that person. But there are obviously shallow reasons also for which the celebrity hangs out with the person, maybe because they just, you know, like to have sycophants around them, right?
Yeah,
so then you learn
yeah.
the person is not that interesting. and then there is this sense of like being close to celebrity yourself. You think, oh, this person could be with anyone and they're choosing to be with me, so therefore I'm special. And, unfortunately, it's not true. Like,
So in an earlier episode, I talked about this kind of heat map of access, where what I find interesting is for each individual, kind of mapping the things that they can do at any given time, and the you could call it like degrees of freedom, like the thing that you are able to do. How many parties could you go to right now? How many dinners could you have right now? How many friends could you talk to right now at this moment? How many buildings could you walk into? That kind of thing. And I think it's interestingly related to what we've all been experiencing this year with quarantine, which is like the amount of restrictions placed on you. And so I think celebrity, and I'm gonna wrap this back to beauty at the very, very end, but celebrity has a degrees of freedom. There's an expansion to it, right? And so I think it's so funny that the proximity to this kind of effectively social status, and I've encountered this also in my job. I hang out with like extremely wealthy people, or just in like neuroscience and hanging out in Silicon Valley. Sometimes there's occasionally wealthy people. And what ends up happening is the same gravitational like pull. I see it in people go towards them, where they always listen to what the person says.
Yeah.
They never turn away. Their jokes, if they're in the middle of a joke, they'll wait to finish it until the celebrity, rich person, beautiful person is listening. It's like this attention economy. And I think the underlying logic is specious, first of all, but it's that celebrity, beautiful person, rich person could be doing so many things, but they're doing this right now, whereas I could be doing fewer things.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm going to kind of latch onto their degrees of freedom, or
why
latch
is it
onto
specious? That seems reasonable in a way.
because it's a kind of I guess if you allow it to be a kind of currency, like access to things being almost a resource. But
Right.
effectively what people are doing is trying to get closer to that resource. But it's actually quite, like, I think the logic is that by virtue of them having chosen this, it somehow rubs off on me or the person nearby as if they had the same amount of options, but were choosing to do the thing that they're doing, which is just, staring at probably the back of a celebrity who's ignoring them. And so I think what's happening is they're attempting to inherit, in a germ theory level, they're attempting to catch the amount of things that the other person could do. And the way that I think this relates to beauty is it's an instant kind of wealth. It's an instant celebrity.
Yeah.
Where people will treat a beautiful person with instant regard for, they could be doing different things right now, but they're not. And therefore proximity to them on Instagram, just by following someone who ignores you for the rest of your life, feels like you're closer to that.
Yeah. It's also a currency though, that like it works for an instant, and then like let's say you meet somebody who's super attractive and you're more apt to listen to what they have to say. If what they have to say then is like, it opens the door, but then if what they start to say is like really boring, or you realize that their beauty is only skin deep, and it will only work for so long, right? It can be like a spark, basically, to open the door, to give to have a certain access. But then if the person's an idiot, like it's only gonna go so far.
So I'm talking less. So last time it was, we narrowed it down to, or it was mentioned like, is the purpose just, maybe it's not actually that more fulfilling of a life, when we were debating the IQ versus 10 percentile points,
right?
Like what would we trade in a monkey spa way? It's like, how do we get value out of life? And it's actually not where is value, and it's probably not sleeping with beautiful person X over and over, that's empty at some point of time. That's not the thing I'm talking about, though. I think that's way too narrow. I'm kind of talking about the large way in which you're not even interacting with them. So like, people will follow someone on Instagram, the thousands of people that the grandma knows from the machine stops. I bet they probably Ian Forster did not imagine that people would just follow you, not know you at all, but still maintain a social connection as if having your phone number. It's effectively the equivalent of having someone's phone number but never using it. Right. Like, but you get access to their life, their photo album. You're showing your photo album to fucking strangers, 10,000 strangers, right? Like the grandma in the story probably had a photo album, and she would show it to people that mattered and whose people, like the opinion of people she cared about and loved, and like would proud and, you know, hold it open on the couch. And now the photo album is just out, and it's I don't know. It's not to me about okay, you're talking with a person and you do or do not sleep with them, or you do or do not listen to them more, and then that fundamentally becomes empty, because that interaction is just a very, very tiny part of what's actually happening, which is this whole ecosystem where these things matter, even when two people don't even interact.
Yeah. Okay, that's an hour. We have still more to talk about. We'll have to do part 3 of this.
Yeah.
But thanks for listening, everyone. Please leave your comments if you're watching this on YouTube.
See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.